You think you know how power works? You think a uniform and a loud voice make you the boss? Think again. In an airport, one mistake, one moment of arrogance can cost you everything. Watch closely. A power-tripping agent thought he spotted an easy target, a quiet black woman, traveling alone with a strange metal case. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted to make her break. But he didn't check her credentials. He didn't know that the badge inside her pocket didn't just open doors. It could shut down the entire airport. This is the story of how one man's ego met a clearance level that doesn't exist on paper. The fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare International Airport hummed with a frequency that Dr. Valerie Cross could feel in her teeth. It was 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. The terminal was a blur of exhausted families, businessmen loosening their ties, and college students sleeping on their backpacks. Valerie adjusted the strap of her leather satchel, her shoulders aching. She wasn't dressed for first class, even though that's where her ticket was booked. She wore a violently yellow oversized hoodie, grey sweatpants, and worn-out sneakers. To the casual observer, she looked like a tired grad student, or maybe an exhausted young mother escaping for a weekend. She certainly didn't look like the lead virologist for the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, ARPA-H, holding a Level 5 biosecurity clearance. She just wanted to get home to D.C. The contents of the metallic, lock-sealed briefcase in her right hand were temperature-sensitive. It wasn't dangerous. Not yet. But the prototype vac-sealed vials inside represented 3 years of work on a synthetic antibody for the H5N1 strain. Zone 1 boarding for Flight 492 to Dulles, the intercom crackled. Valerie exhaled, a puff of relief. She moved toward the priority lane. The gate lice, the people hovering before their zone is called, parted reluctantly. She kept her head down, clutching her boarding pass. That was when she saw him. Standing just past the gate agent's podium, arms crossed over a chest that had seen too many bench presses and not enough cardio, was a man whose name tag read G.P. Miller. He wasn't TSA. TSA was back at the main checkpoint. He was wearing the darker blue uniform of a private security contractor, often hired for enhanced gate screening during high-alert periods. Miller was scanning the crowd with the hungry look of a predator who hadn't eaten in a week. His eyes skipped over the man in the bespoke suit. They skipped over the elderly white couple. They landed with magnetic precision on Valerie. He looked at her hoodie. He looked at her sweatpants. And then his eyes locked onto the metallic briefcase clamped to her wrist. Valerie saw the shift in his posture, the slight puffing of the chest. She knew this look. She had seen it at conferences, in boardrooms, and in luxury stores. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here." She tightened her grip on the handle. "Just walk past," she told herself. "Don't engage. You have diplomatic courier status for the case. Just get on the plane." She handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant, a kind-faced woman named Sarah. The scanner beeped green. "Welcome aboard, Miss Cross." Sarah smiled. "Dr. Cross." A voice boomed from the side. "Hold it right there." The air in the jet bridge seemed to freeze. Valerie stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She closed her eyes for a microsecond, praying for patience. "Is there a problem?" Valerie asked, turning slowly. Miller stepped forward, blocking the entrance to the jet bridge. He was tall, looming over her 5'6" frame. He had a buzz cut and a jawline that twitched with irritation. "Random screening," Miller said, though there was nothing random about the smirk playing on his lips. "Step to the side, ma'am. We need to check that bag." "I've already been through TSA pre-check," Valerie said, her voice calm, measured. "And this bag has been cleared by the hazardous materials desk at check-in. It's sealed." Miller chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. TSA misses things, sweetheart, and I don't care what the desk said. I'm the final line of defense for this aircraft. Step 2. The side. Valerie stepped out of the flow of traffic. The line of passengers behind her groaned. A businessman in a grey suit checked his Rolex and sighed loudly. Unbelievable. They weren't annoyed at Miller. They were annoyed at her. In their eyes, she was the hold-up. She was the disruption. Miller gestured to a stainless steel table set up near the window. Bag up here. Open it. Valerie placed the silver case on the table. It was heavy, reinforced with titanium corners. I cannot open this case here, she stated firmly. It maintains a pressurized vacuum. If I open it outside of a sterile environment, the samples inside will degrade within 60 seconds. It is worth $4 million of government funding. Miller stared at her. Then he laughed. It was a loud, performative laugh, meant for the audience of boarding passengers. $4 million, Miller repeated, looking back at the line. Did you hear that, folks? We got a millionaire in sweatpants here. Listen, lady, I don't care if you have the crown jewels in there. You open the bag, or you don't fly. That's the rule. That is not the rule, Valerie corrected him. Her heart was hammering, but her face was stone. Read the tag on the handle. It's a Federal Diplomatic Courier tag, code 88 Zulu. You do not have the clearance to authorize a breach of this seal. Call your supervisor. Miller's face darkened. The playful arrogance vanished, replaced by a dangerous, thin-skinned anger. He leaned in close, invading her personal space. She could smell stale coffee and peppermint gum. I am the supervisor on the floor tonight, Miller hissed. And I don't like your tone. You think because you printed out some fancy tag you can boss me around? You fit the profile. What profile? Valerie asked sharply. The profile of a tired scientist? The profile of a drug mule moving product in a fancy box, Miller said, loud enough for the first 10 people in line to hear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman with a baby whispered, "Oh my God, drugs!" That is a baseless accusation, Valerie said, her voice dropping an octave. Officer Miller, I am going to ask you one time to step away from the case. If you force this open, you are committing a federal felony under the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989. Miller scoffed. He reached for his belt and unclipped a heavy, rubberized baton, not to hit her, but to use as a pry bar. He tapped the baton against the delicate digital lock of her case. Thwack. Don't touch it, Valerie snapped, her hand instinctively moving to cover the lock. Get your hands off, Miller shouted, jumping back as if she had attacked him. She's resisting. We have a non-compliant passenger. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch. This is Miller at Gate B12. I need backup. I have a hostile female refusing a search, possibly carrying contraband. I'm initiating a code red denial of boarding. The gate agent, Sarah, looked terrified. Miller, wait, she's a priority passenger. Quiet, Sarah, Miller barked. He turned back to Valerie, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. You're done. You're not going to DC. You're going to a holding cell. The atmosphere at Gate B12 had shifted from annoyance to fear. Miller's declaration of a code red meant the jet bridge door was automatically locked. No one else could board. The flight was stalled. Valerie looked at the clock. 11:28 p.m. If those samples didn't get into the sub-zero containment unit at Walter Reed Hospital, by 2 a.m. Eastern, the proteins would denature. Years of work, gone. Officer Miller, Valerie said, trying a different tactic. Appeasement. Look, I understand you are doing your job. I respect the security protocols, but I have identification in my pocket that will explain everything. Please let me show you my credentials. Miller smirked. Oh, now we're begging? now that the cops are coming? He shook his head. Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't reach for anything. 2 airport police officers, actual Chicago PD, came jogging down the concourse. They looked winded and annoyed. One was an older sergeant named Kowalski. The other was a younger rookie. "What's the problem here, Miller?" Kowalski asked, eyeing Valerie. "She's refusing a search," Miller lied smoothly. "She's carrying a suspicious metal container, claims it's government property, and became physically aggressive when I attempted to screen it." "Physically aggressive?" Valerie repeated, incredulous. "I touched the case to stop him from smashing the digital lock with a baton." Kowalski looked at Valerie. He took in the hoodie, the sweatpants, the messy hair. Then he looked at Miller in his crisp uniform. The bias was immediate and subconscious. "Ma'am," Kowalski said, hand resting near his holster, "I need you to step away from the bag and put your hands behind your back. We're going to sort this out downtown." "I cannot leave the bag," Valerie said. "It stays within arm's reach of me at all times. That is the protocol." "You don't make the protocols," Miller sneered from the sidelines. "Cuff her, Sarge. Check her pockets. I bet you find a stash." Kowalski moved forward, pulling out a pair of zip ties. "Ma'am, turn around." "Officer," Valerie said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage, "if you arrest me, you need to understand who I am. My name is Dr. Valerie Cross. I report directly to the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. If you detain me, you are detaining a national security asset." "Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England," Miller laughed. "Wrap her up." Kowalski grabbed Valerie's arm. It was firm, not gentle. He twisted her wrist behind her back. Valerie winced in pain. "You are making a mistake." "Stop talking," Kowalski grunted. He began to pat her down. He felt the bulge in her inner hoodie pocket. "What's this?" "The weapon?" He reached into her pocket and pulled out a slim, black leather wallet. It didn't look like a normal wallet. It had no zippers. It was stamped with a gold seal that was worn from use. Miller stepped closer, craning his neck. "There it is. Let's see the fake ID." Kowalski flipped the wallet open. He froze. The air conditioning in the terminal hummed, but for Sergeant Kowalski, the world went silent. He wasn't looking at a driver's license. He wasn't looking at a Costco card. He was looking at a solid metal badge embedded in the leather. It wasn't the gold of the police or the silver of security. It was black enamel with a silver eagle, and below it, a holographic chip that shimmered red under the fluorescent lights. Under the badge, the text didn't say agent. It didn't say officer. It read Department of Defense, Pentagon, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA. Clearance, Yankee White, Special Access. Kowalski's eyes widened. He had served in the Marines before being a cop. He knew what Yankee White meant. It meant you could walk into the Oval Office without being searched. It meant you commanded resources that local cops couldn't even dream of. "Miller," Kowalski whispered, his face draining of color. "What?" Miller asked, oblivious. "Fake, right? Probably printed it off the dark web." Kowalski slowly released Valerie's arm. He didn't just let go. He pulled his hands back, as if her skin was red-hot iron. He stepped back, straightening his posture, a look of pure horror in his eyes. "Miller," Kowalski said, his voice cracking. "Shut up." Miller frowned. "What is your problem? Give me that." Before Kowalski could stop him, Miller snatched the badge from the sergeant's hand. "Let's see what kind of toy we have here." Miller looked at the badge. He squinted. He didn't recognize the agency name immediately. To a mall cop like him, if it wasn't FBI or CIA, it wasn't real. Defense threat. "Whatever," Miller scoffed, Looks like a prop from a movie. He looked at Valerie, holding the badge up like a trophy. You expect me to believe this? You expect me to believe a girl in a yellow hoodie is... He glanced at the badge again. Special access? He made the mistake. The fatal mistake. I'm going to run this through the scanner, Miller announced, and when it comes back as not found, I'm going to personally throw you in the cell. Valerie's eyes went wide. Do not scan that badge, she warned, her voice deadly quiet. Officer Miller, listen to me very carefully. That chip is encrypted with a localized failsafe. If you run it through a standard civilian terminal, it will interpret it as a hacking attempt. Blah, 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 Miller said, walking over to his podium computer. Miller, don't! Kowalski yelled, reaching out. But Miller was too fast. He wanted to win. He wanted to be right. He took the black badge and slammed it onto the NFC reader of the airport boarding gate terminal. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Miller turned back to Valerie with a grin. See? Nothing. Fine. Whoop! The sound wasn't a beep. It was a low mechanical groan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Suddenly, the screen at the podium flashed bright red. Unauthorized access detected. DoD asset compromised. Location, IID gate, B12. Initiating lockdown protocol. The lights in the terminal flickered. The electronic gate doors slammed shut with a violent hydraulic hiss, locking the passengers on the jet bridge and locking everyone else out in the terminal. The scrolling LED signs that listed flight times suddenly went black, then replaced with a single flashing message. Security breach. Miller stared at the screen, his mouth open. What? What did you do? Valerie straightened her hoodie. She rubbed her wrist where Kowalski had grabbed her. She looked at Miller with eyes that held zero sympathy. I didn't do anything, she said. You just tried to hack the Pentagon. The silence that followed the lockdown wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating. The alarms had cut out after 10 seconds, leaving only the strobe lights flashing red against the walls of Terminal B. Miller was frantically tapping the keyboard at the podium. Piece of junk, he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. It's frozen. Why is it frozen? You need to step away from the terminal, Valerie said. She hadn't moved. She stood like a statue in the center of the storm she hadn't caused, but had warned against. Shut up! Miller spun around, pointing a finger at her. You hacked the system. I saw it. You used a jamming device. Miller, Sergeant Kowalski said, his voice trembling. She didn't touch the computer. You did. The glass doors to the jet bridge hissed open. Manual override from the other side. The pilot stormed out. Captain Bill Henderson was a man who had flown commercial for 30 years, and Air Force transports for 10 before that. He had grey hair, 4 stripes on his shoulder, and 0 patience for delays. Who killed my avionics? Henderson demanded. His voice boomed through the quiet gate area. My cockpit just went dead. The flight management system is black. The tower says we're flagged as a hostile ground event. Who did this? Miller pointed immediately at Valerie. Her! She's got a device! She's a hacker! Captain Henderson looked at Valerie. He took in the yellow hoodie, the calm posture, and the metallic case at her feet. Then he looked at Miller, who was shaking, and the red security breach flashing on every screen behind him. Valerie looked the captain in the eye. Captain, I am Dr. Valerie Cross. I am a courier for the Department of Defense. Officer Miller here seized a Level 5 credentials badge and attempted to scan it on an unsecured civilian network, triggering a local subnet lockdown to protect the encryption keys. Your avionics are dead because the airport's Wi-Fi handshake has been severed to prevent data exfiltration. Henderson blinked. He looked at the badge still sitting on the podium counter. He looked back at Miller. You scanned a DoD badge on a boarding pass reader? Henderson asked, his voice low and dangerous. It looked fake, Miller stammered. It looked like a toy. How was I supposed to know? You ask, Henderson roared. You ask before you shut down my airplane. I'm fixing it, Miller yelled, panic making his voice high and shrill. He reached for the power cord of the computer, intending to yank it out and reboot. Don't! Valerie and Kowalski shouted in unison, but Miller yanked the cord. The screen went black. A second later, the overhead speakers crackled to life. But it wasn't the friendly airline voice. It was a robotic, synthesized voice that echoed through the entire concourse. Attention! Terminal breach confirmed at Gate B12. Sector isolation in effect. All passengers remain in place. Armed response inbound. Passengers began to scream. People dropped to the floor, covering their heads. The mother with the baby started crying hysterically. Miller stood holding the plug in his hand, looking like a child who had just broken a vase. I just reset it. You didn't reset it, Valerie said, checking her watch. You just severed the connection while the failsafe was active. Now the system thinks the threat, that's you, Miller, is attempting to go dark. You just escalated this from a digital containment to a physical response. Valerie reached into her other pocket and pulled out a simple flip phone, a burner, strictly for secure comms. She flipped it open. Who are you calling? Miller demanded, though he lacked the conviction he'd had 5 minutes ago. You can't make calls. Valerie ignored him. She pressed a single-speed dial button. Director, she said into the phone. Crosshair. Yes, I'm at O'Hare. We have a code 09. An incompetent contractor forced a scan of the Yankee White credential. Yes, the samples are safe, but the temperature regulator is on battery. I have maybe 90 minutes before degradation. I need an extraction. And Director? Someone needs to explain to the local authorities why they are pointing guns at me. She closed the phone. Who was that? Kowalski asked, his face pale. That, Valerie said, looking at the glass walls overlooking the tarmac, was the person who signs your boss's checks. The silence that descended on Gate B12 following the lockdown wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick with dread. The alarms had cut out after 10 seconds, leaving only the strobe lights flashing a rhythmic, bloody red against the walls of Terminal B. For 10 minutes, time seemed to warp. The air conditioning hummed, sounding like a dying engine. No planes taxied, no jet engines whined. It was as if the entire organism of O'Hare International Airport had suffered a massive stroke. Miller was pacing back and forth near the podium, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. He looked like a trapped animal. This is crazy, he muttered, wiping sweat from his upper lip. It's just a badge. I'll just tell them it was a glitch. They can't fire me for being thorough. I was doing my job. You were being a bully, Captain Henderson said from the doorway of the jet bridge. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching Miller with a look of profound disgust. And now you're a liability. Shut up, Miller snapped, his voice cracking. You don't know the protocols. He stopped. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the tarmac, the lighting changed. The usual wash of yellow sodium lamps was suddenly cut by piercing white beams. Airport vehicles are standard. White baggage tugs, yellow fuel trucks, orange safety cars. They are slow and predictable. The vehicles tearing across the tarmac toward Gate B12 were none of those things. 3 massive matte black Chevrolet Suburbans were moving in a tight formation, ignoring the painted taxiway lines, cutting directly across the path of a stalled Boeing 737. Behind them roared a Lenco Bearcat armored personnel carrier, Homeland Security, stenciled in stark white letters across its flank. Blue and red strobe lights reflected off the terminal glass, turning the waiting area into a disco of impending doom. "Oh my God," the businessman in the grey suit whispered, pressing his hand to the glass. Is that a SWAT team?" The vehicle screeched to a halt right next to the plane's front gear, boxing in the jet bridge. The doors flew open in perfect synchronization. 12 tactical officers poured out. They weren't wearing the polyester uniforms of airport police. They were clad in heavy tactical armor, Kevlar helmets with night vision mounts, and balaclavas. They carried short-barreled carbines held at the low ready. They moved with a terrifying, fluid speed, the kind of movement that says, "We are not here to negotiate." They didn't run up the jet bridge stairs. They breached the secure emergency door from the tarmac level directly into the terminal, bypassing the normal route. Boom! The emergency exit door at the gate blew open with a violent metallic crash that made half the passengers scream. The tactical team swarmed into the waiting area, weapons raised, sweeping the room with laser sights that cut through the red strobe light. "Federal agents, everyone down, hands on your heads, now!" The command was a wall of sound. The passengers scrambled to obey, terrified. People dropped to the dirty carpet, covering their heads. The mother with the baby was crying hysterically, curling her body around her child. Miller froze. His brain couldn't process the shift. He was the authority here. He was the one who called for backup. He stood by the podium, his baton still dangling from his belt, a confused smile plastering itself onto his face. He raised a hand, waving. "Over here. I'm the security officer. I'm the one who called it in. The suspect is right on the ground!" The lead tactical officer didn't slow down. He swung the muzzle of his rifle, and a red laser dot appeared directly on Miller's sternum. "Drop the weapon belt! Get on your knees! Do it now!" Miller blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. It's just a baton. I'm on your side." "Last warning." The officer took a step forward, his finger hovering over the trigger guard. Panic finally pierced Miller's delusion. He fumbled frantically with the clasp of his belt, his fingers slippery with sweat. He threw the heavy belt onto the floor with a clatter and dropped to his knees, his hands shooting into the air. "Don't shoot! I'm down! I'm down!" 2 officers moved past him, clearing the room. Another aimed his rifle at Valerie. Valerie remained standing. She didn't drop. She didn't raise her hands. She stood like a statue in the center of the chaos, clutching the metallic briefcase to her leg. "Ma'am, get on the ground!" A rookie tactical officer shouted at her, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Drop the bag!" "Stand down!" The voice came from the rear of the tactical stack. It wasn't shouted, but it carried a weight that cut through the noise instantly. The wall of armored soldiers parted. A man walked through the gap. He wasn't wearing armor. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Miller made in 3 months. He had silver hair, rimless glasses, and he held a tablet loosely in one hand. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a lawyer who authorized airstrikes before breakfast. This was Assistant Director Cole. Cole walked straight past the trembling Miller, stepping over the discarded duty belt as if it were trash. He walked past the terrified Sergeant Kowalski, who was pressing himself into the wall. He stopped 3 feet in front of Valerie. The room held its breath. Was she the target? Was she the mastermind? Cole looked at Valerie. He looked at the oversized yellow hoodie. He looked at the messy bun. Then his eyes dropped to the metallic case. Slowly, deliberately, Cole nodded. It was a nod of deep, professional respect. "Dr. Cross," he said, his voice calm and cultured. "My sincere apologies for the delay. The traffic on the I-190 was absolutely terrible." Valerie let out a long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her shoulders dropped an inch. "It's good to see you, Cole. We have a timeline on the samples. The regulator is on battery backup." We have a helicopter spinning up on the south runway to take you directly to Andrews, Cole assured her, checking his watch. From there, a convoy will take you to Walter Reed. You'll make the window with 20 minutes to spare. Cole turned slowly to survey the room. The tactical team stood at ease now, barrels lowered, but the threat remained. Cole's gaze landed on Miller, who was shaking violently on the carpet, his face pressed into the fibers. "Get up," Cole said. It wasn't a request. Miller scrambled to his feet, his legs wobbling. He looked small, sweaty, and terrified. "Sir, listen, sir. She refused a search. She had a metal case. I was following Protocol 7 Delta. I didn't know who she was." Cole didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the podium where the black badge still sat, abandoned next to the frozen computer screen. He picked it up. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dusted the badge off, treating it like a holy relic before handing it back to Valerie. "Protocol 7 Delta applies to civilian luggage," Cole said, his voice terrifyingly reasonable. "It does not apply to a diplomatic courier carrying a Class A biological asset. Furthermore, Mr. Miller, when you were presented with a federal credential, you didn't call for verification. You didn't ask for a supervisor. You attempted to forcefully bypass digital encryption on a Department of Defense key." Cole stepped closer. He invaded Miller's space, just as Miller had invaded Valerie's. "Do you know what the Pentagon calls an unauthorized attempt to bypass encryption on a Yankee white key, Mr. Miller?" Miller shook his head, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the snot running from his nose. "No. No, sir. They call it an act of cyber warfare," Cole said softly. "Technically, you just declared war on the United States government from an airport gate." Miller's knees gave out. He collapsed back onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "I just wanted her to open the bag. She didn't look like she belonged in first class. She was wearing a hoodie." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the baby had stopped crying. Valerie stepped forward. She looked down at the man huddled on the floor. "That's it, isn't it?" she said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it reached every corner of the room. "It wasn't the bag. It wasn't the protocol. It was the hoodie. It was my hair. You saw a black woman in sweatpants, and you decided I needed to be humbled. You decided to extra screen me because you couldn't reconcile my appearance with my status." She turned to Cole. "I want to file a formal complaint. But not just a complaint. I want a full audit of this contractor." Cole smiled, a thin, shark-like smile that promised violence of the legal variety. "Dr. Cross, you won't need to file anything. We're seizing all the security footage from this terminal for the investigation." "And Mr. Miller?" Miller looked up through tear-filled eyes, a portrait of ruin. "You're not going home tonight," Cole said. "Agent Karras, take him into custody. Federal charges, interference with a federal officer, reckless endangerment, and let's tack on destruction of government property for the avionics on the plane." "Wait, no!" Miller screamed as two tactical officers hoisted him up by his armpits, his feet dragging on the floor. "I was doing my job. I'm a good guard. Ask anyone. Kowalski. Tell them." Sergeant Kowalski turned his back on Miller, staring intently at a poster on the wall, refusing to acknowledge the man he had enabled just minutes ago. As they dragged Miller away, his boots squeaking and his pleas echoing down the concourse, he passed the line of passengers. The businessman in the suit, the one who had sighed at Valerie earlier, looked at Miller and simply shook his head. "Idiot." Valerie adjusted her grip on the briefcase. She looked at Sarah, the gate agent, who was trembling behind the desk, her face pale as a sheet. "I'm sorry about the flight delay, Sarah," Valerie said kindly. "The system should reboot in about 10 minutes. It's okay, Sarah whispered, staring at Valerie with wide, awe-struck eyes. Have a safe flight, Doctor. Cole gestured to the door where the black SUVs waited. Shall we? Valerie pulled her yellow hood up over her head. Flanked by 12 heavily armed federal agents, Dr. Valerie Cross walked out of the terminal like royalty. 6 months had passed since the incident at Gate B12, but for George P. Miller, time had not healed anything. It had merely dragged him, day by agonizing day, toward this moment. The courtroom of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois was nothing like the municipal traffic courts Miller was familiar with. Those were chaotic, noisy places, smelling of stale coffee and desperation. This room was a cathedral of intimidation. The walls were paneled in dark, polished mahogany that seemed to absorb the light. The ceiling was impossibly high, making everyone below feel small and insignificant. Behind the judge's bench, the Great Seal of the United States hung like a giant, unblinking eye. Miller sat at the defense table, his suit jacket straining against his back. It wasn't tight from muscle anymore. In the last half-year, stripped of his job and his routine, he had gained 20 pounds of stress weight. His buzz cut had grown out into patchy, thinning hair that he nervously smoothed down every few minutes. He looked at his hands that used to rest confidently on a duty belt, and they were trembling. Beside him sat Evelyn Stone, his public defender. She was a sharp, exhausted woman who had spent the last month trying to save Miller from himself. She had begged the U.S. Attorney's Office for a plea deal. She had offered community service, probation, a public apology, anything to avoid a trial. But the Department of Justice wasn't interested in a deal. They didn't want a handshake. They wanted a head on a pike. All rise, the bailiff's voice cut through the heavy silence. Judge Harrison Thorne entered. He was a man who looked like he had been carved from the same mahogany as the walls, stern, grey-haired, and radiating an aura of absolute intolerance for nonsense. He took his seat, the black robe settling around him like storm clouds. United States versus George Patrick Miller, Judge Thorne read from the docket, his voice dry as parchment. Charges include obstruction of federal proceedings, unauthorized access to a protected computer system, and false imprisonment of a federal agent. Miller flinched at the list. Hearing it out loud made it sound so much worse than it felt in his head. I just stopped a passenger, he thought frantically. I just wanted to check a bag. The prosecutor stood up. Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Sterling was a shark in a charcoal suit. He didn't look at Miller. He looked at the jury as if they were old friends he was about to tell a tragic secret. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sterling began, walking slowly toward the box. The government intends to prove that Mr. Miller engaged in a pattern of discriminatory harassment that culminated in a significant national security breach. This was not a mistake. This was not a computer glitch. This was a choice. Sterling stopped, letting the silence hang. He ignored 3 separate verbal warnings, Sterling continued, ticking them off on his fingers. He ignored the presentation of valid credentials. He ignored the protocols of his own job. He acted out of ego and bias, endangering a critical biological asset worth millions of dollars and risking the safety of every soul on that aircraft. Miller leaned over to his lawyer, whispering fiercely, "They're making it sound like I'm a terrorist. I just tapped a badge on a scanner. It was a mistake." "Shh," Stone hissed, not even looking at him. She was scribbling notes furiously. "You shut down an international airport terminal and grounded a commercial flight, George. You cost the airline $400,000 in delays alone. You aren't a terrorist, but you are a liability. Keep your mouth shut." The government's case was a sledgehammer. They didn't need theatrics because the facts were damning enough. First came Sergeant Kowalski. The older cop looked uncomfortable in his dress blues. He had retired 2 months early, a quiet exit to avoid internal affairs charges for his own role that night. He sat in the witness stand, refusing to make eye contact with Miller. Mr. Miller was aggressive from the start, Kowalski told the jury, his voice gravelly. He was agitated. Dr. Cross was calm. She warned him about the encryption. She told him exactly what would happen. And what was the defendant's reaction to this warning? Sterling asked. He laughed, Kowalski said. He called the badge a fake. He said she fit the profile. Sterling paused. He let the words hang in the air. And what profile was that, Sergeant? Kowalski looked down at his hands, ashamed. A drug mule, because of how she was dressed, because she was a young black woman in a hoodie traveling first class. The jury shifted in their seats. Miller felt their eyes on him, burning like lasers. He wanted to scream that it wasn't like that he was just being thorough, but he knew nobody believed him. Then came the evidence. The lights in the courtroom dimmed, and the massive screens on the wall flickered to life. The security footage from Gate B12 played. It was silent, but the silence was louder than shouting. The jury watched Miller looming over the smaller woman. They saw the aggressive posture, the way he invaded her personal space. They saw him poke her expensive case with his baton, a gesture that looked thuggish on the big screen. They saw him snatch the badge from Kowalski's hand with a sneer. And then they saw the slam, the moment of hubris. Miller slamming the badge onto the reader. A second later, the terminal lights on the video flickered. The passengers dropped to the floor in terror. The mother shielding her baby. The fear was palpable, even through the grainy footage. Miller sank lower in his chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. On that screen, he didn't look like a guardian. He looked like a bully. He looked like a tyrant with a plastic badge. The prosecution calls Dr. Valerie Cross. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Valerie walked in. She wasn't wearing the yellow hoodie today. She wore a sharp navy blazer, her hair pulled back in a severe, professional bun. She walked to the stand with the same calm grace she had shown at the airport. She didn't look at Miller. To her, he was already part of the past. She was sworn in. Her voice was clear, melodic, and devastatingly composed. Dr. Cross, Sterling asked gently. In that moment, at the gate, did you feel threatened? Valerie turned to the jury. I felt that if I made a sudden movement, he would strike me with his baton, she said. His aggression was escalating with every word I spoke. Did you consider opening the case to appease him? Absolutely not, Valerie said, her voice hardening slightly. That would have violated Federal Law 42 U.S.C. 262 regarding the transport of Class A biological agents. If I opened that seal in a non-sterile environment, I would be committing a felony. Worse, if the samples had been compromised, years of research would be destroyed. Mr. Miller gave me an impossible choice. Go to prison for opening it, or go to prison for not opening it. She paused, and for the first time, she looked directly at Miller. Her eyes were not angry, they were pitying. He created a trap, she said softly, simply because he didn't like my face. Miller's lawyer, Evelyn Stone, tried to cross-examine her, but it was a hopeless task. Dr. Cross, Stone tried, isn't it possible Mr. Miller was just confused by the rarity of your credentials? Yankee White clearance isn't something a private contractor sees every day. That is true, Valerie conceded. But when you see something you don't understand, the protocol is to call a supervisor. It is not to mock the passenger and attempt to hack the device. Ignorance is a reason to pause, Miss Stone. It is not a license to attack. The trial lasted 3 days, but it felt over in 3 hours. The jury didn't stay out long, less than an afternoon. They barely had time to finish their coffee in the deliberation room. When they returned, the foreman stood up. He was a middle-aged man who wouldn't look at the defense table. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Thorne commanded. Miller stood up. His legs felt like they were made of water. He gripped the table to keep from collapsing. "Please," he prayed. "Please just let it be a fine." "We find the defendant, George Patrick Miller," the foreman read, "on the count of obstruction of federal proceedings. Guilty." Miller let out a small, strangled sound. "On the count of unauthorized access to a protected computer system. Guilty. On the count of false imprisonment of a federal agent. Guilty." Evelyn Stone closed her eyes and sighed. Miller stared straight ahead, his world dissolving into white noise. The gavel banged, dismissing the jury, but Miller didn't hear it. All he could hear was the echo of his own voice from 6 months ago, arrogant and loud in the airport terminal, telling a scientist she didn't belong. He had been right. Someone didn't belong. But he had been wrong about who it was. The sentencing hearing arrived 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that was grey and weeping with rain. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois didn't feel like a place of justice to George Miller. It felt like a tomb. Miller sat at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were white. He had spent the last fortnight out on bail, pacing his living room, telling himself that it wouldn't be that bad. "Probation," he had whispered to his bathroom mirror. "They'll give me probation. I'm a first-time offender. I have a clean record. I was just doing my job too aggressively." But when Judge Harrison walked into the room, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison was not a man who believed in probation for abuses of power. He adjusted his glasses, looking down from the high bench with a gaze that felt heavy enough to crush bone. "Mr. Miller," the judge began, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "I have read the pre-sentencing report. I have read the letters of support from your former colleagues, claiming you are a diligent worker. And I have reviewed the video evidence of the incident at Gate B12. Miller swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the silence. "You held a position of trust," Judge Harrison continued, leaning forward. "In an airport, security personnel are the first line of defense. People look to you for safety. They submit to your authority because they believe it is exercised with judgment and neutrality. Instead, you became the threat." Miller tried to speak, to offer the apology he had rehearsed 1,000 times, but his voice failed him. He just nodded, tears pricking his eyes. "You judged a book by its cover," the judge said, his voice rising in volume, filling the room. "And when you didn't like the title, you tried to burn the library down. You looked at Dr. Cross, a woman serving her country at the highest level, and you decided she was unworthy of respect because she wore a hoodie. You decided she was unimportant. That arrogance is not a mistake, Mr. Miller. It is a character flaw, and it is dangerous." Miller slumped. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't know." "That is exactly the problem," the judge boomed, cutting him off. "A true professional treats everyone with respect, whether they are a CEO in a bespoke suit or a student in sweatpants. You failed that basic test of humanity." The gavel rose. To Miller it looked like a hammer of doom. "George Patrick Miller, I sentence you to 36 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are also ordered to pay restitution to the airline in the amount of $150,000 for the operational disruption caused by your negligence." Whack! The sound was final. It rang in Miller's ears like a gunshot. 36 months, he gasped. He didn't get a chance to argue. The bailiff was already behind him. There was the cold, mechanical snick-snick of handcuffs tightening around his wrists, not the plastic zip ties he used to carry, but heavy steel. He wasn't the one holding the keys anymore. Prison was a slow, grinding erosion of the soul. For a former security guard, the federal penitentiary was a nightmare. Miller spent his first 6 months in protective custody, isolated from the general population who would have targeted him for his badge. He sat in a 6-axate cell, staring at grey cinder blocks, listening to the shouts and echoes of men he used to look down on. The world outside didn't wait for him. It dismantled him. 4 months into his sentence, the letter came. It wasn't a long letter. His wife, Linda, simply couldn't take it anymore. The $150,000 restitution judgment had put a lien on their assets. The legal fees had drained their savings. The shame of being the airport guy's wife in their small community was too much. "I can't do this, George," the letter read. "I'm moving back to my sister's in Ohio. The bank is taking the house next week. I'm sorry." He lost his marriage and his home on the same Tuesday. He sat on his bunk, holding the paper, weeping silently so the guards wouldn't hear. He had built his life around being the man in charge, the provider, the protector. Now, he was inmate 49201, destitute and alone. When he was released 3 years later, the world had changed. He stepped off the bus in downtown Chicago with $40 in his pocket and a plastic bag of clothes. The air smelled of exhaust and freedom, but it tasted like ash. He tried to get work. He applied to security firms, warehouses, even bouncing gigs at dive bars. But every application had that one box. "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" He had to check, yes. "We can't hire you," a hiring manager at a logistics firm told him, not unkindly. "Insurance liability. You caused a national security incident, George. You're on a list. Nobody is going to trust you with keys again." The slide was steep and brutal. He ended up in a small, cramped apartment near the flight path of O'Hare, the roar of jet engines, a constant, mocking reminder of his failure. 6 months after his release, the only job he could find was washing dishes at a 24-hour diner called The Hangar, located 3 miles from the airport terminals. It was grueling work. The steam from the industrial dishwasher ruined his skin. The grease coated his hair. He wore a stained apron and stared at dirty plates for 8 hours a shift. The man who used to bark orders at passengers was now scraping half-eaten pancakes into a trash bin, invisible to the world. And every time a plane roared overhead, shaking the diner's windows, Miller flinched. His heart would race, panic rising in his throat as he remembered the flashing red lights and the lockdown. Then came the rainy Tuesday that broke him completely. It was 2 a.m. The diner was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Miller was out on the floor, bussing a table near the window. The bell above the door jingled. Miller looked up, wiping his hands on his apron. A woman walked in. She was young, black, and wearing a violently yellow oversized hoodie and grey sweatpants. She carried a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. The world stopped. Miller froze, the dirty rag falling from his hand, his breath hitched in his chest. It was her. It had to be her. Dr. Valerie Cross. She had come to check on him. She had come to see how low he had fallen. He couldn't move. He stood there, paralyzed by a cocktail of shame and terror, his eyes wide. He waited for the tactical team. He waited for the assistant director. He waited for the judgment. The woman sat down in a booth and pulled a textbook out of her bag. She looked up, sensing eyes on her. She wasn't Dr. Cross. She was just a college student, exhausted from studying, looking for caffeine. She had a soft, kind face. "Excuse me?" she called out gently. "Could I get some coffee, please? And maybe a menu? Miller let out a shuddering breath. His knees felt like water. The adrenaline crash left him trembling. It wasn't her, but the ghost of his mistake would haunt him in every face, in every yellow hoodie for the rest of his life. He picked up the coffee pot. His hands, rough and red from the scalding water, shook as he walked toward her table. He lowered his head, forcing his eyes to the floor, terrified to make eye contact. He knew his place now. "Yes, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking with a humility he had learned too late. "Right away, Mom." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why you never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book has a Pentagon clearance level. Miller learned the hard way that true power doesn't need to shout, and it certainly doesn't need to bully. He thought he was the big fish in the pond, only to realize he was swimming with a shark. What would you have done if you were Dr. Cross? Would you have kept your cool, or would you have snapped? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story of entitlement getting shut down. Stay safe, stay kind, and remember, be careful who you mess with.